This year, 2025, actually marks the 75th anniversary of the rupee of independent India. This is why I thought that it could be a good way to sort of celebrate it in a way that we have a national currency, which is its 75th year, and talk about the history of the rupee. And I'm glad to say that I will be curating an exhibition which is going to open at the Sarmaya Foundation in Mumbai at the end of October, 31st of October, and it will be open for the next 3 or 4 months. It is essentially charting the history of the rupee from its inception up to the 75th anniversary. One part of that history is that the fact that the rupee was an international currency during its course, and this talk just sort of focuses on that part about how, and from sort of numismatic perspective, how it all happened in a way. But before we actually go to the rupee, as every numismatist would know, is most famous as a sort of Mughal invention, as it were. But it was not exactly a Mughal invention, but sort of a Mughal sort of denomination. There is a kind of philosophy of money that is expressed in Abul Fazl's Aini Akbari, and he says, what is money and how does it come from? But at the base of it, he says that metals like silver and brass and gold, etc., were created by God to render money serviceable. So this is what God does, and to regulate that is actually a king's sort of prerogative. So the philosophy of money, according to Abul Fazl, sort of goes from God to king, to resources, and then the king's power over regulating the resources, and therefore the god's sort of, the king being sort of the god's deputy in doing all this. And he actually mentions that, and in terms of his denominational description, that rupiah is round and weighs between 11 and a half mashas, and it was first introduced by Sher Khan. And this is exactly the kind of thing that we got to sort of know that the invention, as it were, if at all we can use that word, was by Sher Shah Suri, or as Sher Khan, as the Mughals described him. And it's quite interesting that these silver coins of a certain purity, weighing almost 1 tola in a sort of Indian denominational system. And what Sher Shah appears to have done is that he started issuing these 1 tola silver coins, but then when he became the master of most of North India, he then standardized the collection by fixing that rupee weight, the 1 tola of silver weight, to an equivalent value of copper coins, and that was 40 dams of 20 grams each, roughly. So that was what was the main sort of intervention that he did, and that's why he was called the progenitor of the rupee. And you find that in the same year, actually, his adversary, which was Humayun, also issuing coins to the same denomination. So it's 945 Hijra, which is sort of corresponds to about 1538 and 39. So both these kings are issuing rupee standard coins in the same year. However, going by the evidence of Abul Fazl, we regard Sher Shah Suri as the first progenitor. Probably he started it and maybe Humayun copied it. But we have in the same year, so 1538 really marks the sort of advent of this particular denomination. By the virtue of the monetary reforms that Sher Shah did, this is a map of his empire, and he established mints across the empires. You can see from that sort of Delhi, Sharifabad, Ujjain. So they're scattered across Bakkar, for example. They're all scattered across all over his empire, and they all are start issuing this 1 tola rupee coins. And it was definitely very rigorously engaged with the revenue collection system of this empire. So it was a monetary reform of great consequence that he had initiated. And unfortunately, he didn't get a lot of time to sort of, he famously, he died within a few years of being the emperor, and then the Suri empire then sort of descended into a disintegration very quickly after his death. But what the Mughals did when they sort of came back into the foray, they gave up their own denominational system, which was based on the Central Asian denomination system, which was 4.6 grams of silver being a Shah rupee, and they carried on with this reform. So this was very sagacious of the Mughals to actually surrender something which had been a part of their identity from Central Asia, and to give way to actually striking rupees and then slowly sort of discarding away the Central Asian system that they had. So they realized the importance of having this particular denomination and carrying on with this reform that Sher Shah had instituted. And similarly, so we have immediately afterwards Humayun's return in Hijra 963, which is about 1555, 1556, that he started issuing rupees from Agra as well, and not just the earlier Shah rupees. This is by far one of the most interesting examples, quite famous amongst numismatists, that in the regnal year 47 and 48, Akbar seems to have issued a strange, one-off kind of instance of denominational series of coins where the denominations is actually mentioned. So this is the first instance where the word rupiah is actually appearing on these coins. And we have now about 7 or 8 instances of regnal year, Ilahi month, and the denomination combinations. We also have in the same series denominations referring to the fractions of the rupee. So we have half a rupee and we have a quarter of a rupee. And these denominational references, the names that actually sort of correspond to the mentions of Abul Fazl as well. So it's a very clear-cut evidence of the system being sort of ingrained in this. And then after this sort of, when we come to the 17th century, the rupee then sort of takes off as a denomination within the subcontinent. And that is kind of connected to the functioning and the fiscal apparatus of the Mughal Empire. And it was a centralized and a very efficient monetary administration. Because it was invested in the Islamic concept of kingship, it was rooted in the rights of khutbah and sikka, which meant that the emperor had to the coins had to be issued in the name of the emperor, and the emperor's name had to be mentioned in the Friday prayers. And these were the two imperatives to have the Mughal emperor's name on the coins. And it sort of fed into a larger, much wider subject, such as exchequer management, which included revenue assessment, payment to troops, and tax and tribute collections. And as, of course, the empire expanded, which you can see in this map, how it sort of went from sort of covering the entire subcontinent in a matter of like 150 years or so. And therefore, alongside the spread of the empire, the rupee also spread within the subcontinent. And it was again a matter of circumstance, quite interestingly, that this is the same period in which silver starts pouring in from India. It's quite interesting to know that India has no indigenous sources of silver. The silver has to be, or not any noteworthy sources of silver. In the earlier times, the silver was coming from China mainly, and it sustained a major silver-based monetary system, particularly in Bengal. And that's where, as we saw, the rupee, the invention of the rupee took place. That's where Sher Shah was functioning. So he sort of took that idea of a silver currency from Bengal and applied it to the rest of his empire. But then in the 17th century, particularly, silver that was found in the New World, in particularly in South America, in the mines of Potosi and all those sort of very extremely rich deposits. The mine was worked for 400 years almost, and that was then taken to Europe, and then Europe then brought it to China and India as silver consuming economies. So the sustaining of this denominational reform that Sher Shah had instituted and the Mughals had carried over was entirely also based on the fact that the silver was pouring in from these sources at the same time as well. So it sort of became a kind of a bulwark, and that bolstered the denomination to a certain extent. And this connection between the incoming trade, which is essentially a maritime sort of base, we can see immediately reflected in the minting choices. So a lot of ports then become mint towns. And during the 17th century, Surat becomes the main port town on the western coast, where most of the trade is being landed. But just before Surat, there was Tata in Sindh, which was also playing the same role. And there is an interesting numismatic contribution showing the popularity, as it were, of Thatta Mint in terms of its output with regard to the Portuguese kind of imports of silver at this time. So this starts around late 16th century, late 1500s, then takes off really majorly in by the time of mid 17th century happens, and then subsequently when the European mercantile companies establish their bases, they also start issuing rupees in their port cities, like for example, Chinapatan, which is Madras, was a famous harbor town, or indeed Machilipatan, so on the eastern coast. So you have ports on the western coast, ports on the eastern coast, where this trade was being landed or being sort of being transited, all becoming major mint towns as well, producing these rupees. This was again sort of sustained by the lure of commodities that the companies took over, and this is just a list of how these companies started functioning and the dates of their sort of establishment as joint stockholding companies, but also the dates of the establishment of their branches or factories, the first factories that they established in India. So the English started East India Company was founded in 1600, and they opened their first factory in Surat in 1612, and so on and so forth. So you can see how various European nations then started up operating on the basis of this trade. And this is very important because carrying out this trade required a trustworthy and popular denomination. And the fact that the Mughals had invested such a lot of attention in effectively managing their mints, at least up in the first 2 centuries, made the rupee a strong denomination that could be trusted and therefore beneficial for this trade as well. As a result of that, the emphasis for all the Western companies was to start striking rupees and not have their own denominations. So we have a range of European rupees in India, and you can see that there are certain political implications here as well. The Portuguese that started striking rupees in Goa in the middle of the 16th century have a completely different design than the rest because Estado da India, the Portuguese state of India, was considered a part of Portugal, really. It was not a company that was running it. It was directly sort of considered to be part of the Portuguese kingdom, and that's how it was run. As against that, the companies which you see below here, the left-hand side is a rupee of Mumbai, struck by the British East India Company, and on the right-hand side is the rupee of Pondicherry with the mint name Arcot, struck by the French. They were essentially interested in increasing their acceptability, not just in the coastal trade, but also in the hinterland. So therefore, they opted to have the rupees struck in a sort of Mughal fashion because that was the kind of acceptable design, as it were. So right from the word go, there is an imprint of politics and sort of practices that were affecting this trade um, into the design and the typology of the coins. To cut a long story very short, in the 19th century, the British then sort of consolidate all these different rupees into one. And in 1835, very famously, Uniform Coinage Act was enacted, and the first uniform coinage of 1 rupee was struck in the three British presidencies. And then subsequently, after the Great Revolt of 1857, India was made into a crown colony. So we had the crown issues from 1862 onwards. And each of these coins and each of these designs have a very distinct imprint about them. For example, there's a lot of discussion of how the William rupee designs were launched. And James Prinsep, who suggested some designs, was very keen to have Indian scripts and languages mentioned on them. But to sort of keep matters simple, they just had this one small inscription in, whether you call it Hindustani or whether you call it Urdu, whichever way you look at it. But it says Ek Rupiya, and that's what it is. But and similarly, this portrait on the Crown series in the 1862, this was a unique portrait. And there's a bit of discussion about Leonard Charles Wyan, who created this portrait, and it was definitely to show a sort of Indianized image of the Queen. And this portrait doesn't appear anywhere else apart from in India. And of course, there's the fact that she wears a kind of Mughal style tunic and also has this kind of big imperial crown clearly indicates that she's the queen, as it were, and that these kind of vestiges, visual vestiges of sovereignty and royalty, did actually matter a lot to the Indian population. In the 20th century, because of various economical and political events, as it were, there was a move to launch for the first time paper denominations of 1 rupee. And it is quite interesting that these denominations, right from their inception, even well into the 21st century, the 1 rupee note was a one-to-one replacement for the 1 rupee coin. So it was not issued as a fiduciary note, it was issued as a real 1 rupee replacement coin. And therefore, it was from a design point of view, it is interesting to note that all of these 1 rupee notes actually show the coin on them, and therefore it sort of visually connects it with the coin. And one of the major reasons, to cut a long story very short, is the silver crisis in the late 19th century, when the price of silver relative to gold started getting inflated, and the silver started getting cheaper. So it was it and to an economy that was like India, which was mainly based on silver, that caused a remittance problem. This is a colonial problem, really, so that the money that was being remitted out of India to Britain started falling short because the silver started losing its price. So therefore, there was an imperative to fix the exchange value of the rupee to the pound, and then move a lot of the rupee into the realm of fiduciary currencies. So these the politics of the policies of colonial fiscal extraction can go on in this matter. And that sort of changed in the First World War to a certain extent, because the price of the silver went up again because of the shortfall in supply. And people started hoarding the silver rupees, and therefore the government then decided to actually launch the first paper rupee in 1917. Something similar happened in the 1920s when they were about to do that during sort of around the Depression time, but they did not do it at that time. But the notes were kind of ready, and then they were launched. The same notes were launched in during the Second World War. So these notes were actually having the picture of George V, but they were launched much later, after his death, actually. And these were again the same instances. Interestingly, these were issued as little checkbooks, and you had them in bundles of booklets of 25, and you could tear off these notes and use them. So they were issued in these booklets. So it was kind of an interesting way of issuing these. Much to that, on the back of that, other colonial entities in India also started issuing their paper rupees. So we have an example of the French Indochina, Bank of French Indochina issuing the rupee in Pondicherry, and also the Portuguese colonial Banco Nacional Ultramarino issuing rupees sort of decreeing them to be used in Lisbon, but then putting them used in the Portuguese possessions in India. In a way, the internationalization of the rupee is kind of rooted in these historic backdrops. As I said, because the rupee was such suitable for commanding trust and popularity in the established Indian Ocean trade network, it started to be used as a standard currency where the tradition of local coinage was almost non-existent. So, for example, when the Dutch started trading with the East Indies, um, there was no indigenous coinage there, as it were. It was all to do with imported coinage, and therefore they thought that one of the imported coinages that they could trust to be used on the islands of Java and Sumatra, or in Ceylon, was the Mughal rupee, and they started counter-striking these for local use. So these were taken to these places, and then they were countermarked for local use into these places. So here we have an example of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, with a C mark on top of it that denotes Colombo, and it was stuck in. It was countermarked in Ceylon to be used on the island as its local currency. And similarly, in 1693, there is a decree that we have rupees from Surat again counterstruck with this horse rider symbol that sort of is copied from the horse rider on the Dutch guilders and ducatoons, big silver coins. And therefore, it sort of symbolized the Dutch authority, and they were then put in circulation in Java, in Batavia. And we have this very unusual example of a early 19th century coin from North India traveling somehow into the island of Madura, which is to the north of Bali, of Java. And it has this particular countermark, which is called Madura Star, which you can see on the obverse of this coin. And it's a stamp which was put by the local sultanate on the Madura Island on imported coins to be used locally. So this is one example of almost unique example of a North Indian rupee of the early 19th century traveling all the way to Madura and then being counterstamped there. Counterstamping was not just was just but one way of assimilating these so-called foreign coins, but the impact of the design was so much, the kind of the impact of the Mughal design, having these tripartite inscriptions on both sides, that similar inscriptions were then conceived on the local currencies that were issued by the companies then when they started issuing their own coins. In so apart from just using the imported counterstruck coins, the next step was to start their own currencies, and these were then essentially, in some sense of visual resemblance, familiar and therefore sort of similar to the Mughal rupees. And here we have example of the Dutch rupee of Java, the Dutch rupee of Ceylon, and in early 19th century, when the British occupied Java, they issued their own rupees there, and this was during the Napoleonic Wars because Netherlands was conquered by Napoleon, so the British sort of went out and conquered the Dutch territories around India, and these were struck in Java, and you can immediately see that the whole style, the way the mint indicator Zarb is written on the reverse is very much like a Mughal rupee. So there is a stylistic imprint of the Mughal rupee still very much in the designs when local currencies start being issued there as well. And then the sort of things the import of these foreign currencies also continues. And here you have a Iranian rupee coin, which is again countermarked Java by the Dutch in again to be used in Java, and the visual and linguistic sort of impact continues because even when in the 20th century the Dutch issue guilder style coinage in the Dutch East Indies, so this is 1939 coin of a quarter guilder, on the reverse in the Javanese inscription it is still called a rupee. So it's and it says quarter rupiah in for those who can read easily Javanese. It's not that different from Persian, but that vocabulary still continues. So even if it's a guilder, and then of course the when the Japanese occupy these islands during the Second World War, they also start hitting. So there's a Japanese rupee here as well. So you can see that the intermingling of political, trade, and anthropological aspects to create this impact of rupee are quite interesting, and they could be unpicked one by one. Even as a collective narrative, it's quite fun to see these things happening. On the other side of the Indian subcontinent towards the west, these trade networks, and this is again the rupees and pies in East Africa map. Borrowed from this wonderful coin atlas, which was co-edited by Joe several years ago. You have these were the kind of trading networks that were effectively in place even before the Europeans arrived, and therefore we don't have a clear archival kind of evidence that we find in cases of, say, the Dutch East India Company, about how these links were sustained, how the currency links between these were sustained. But on at least on the coastal areas, by the time 19th century arrived, the rupee was already an established and popular denomination. And therefore, when these regions were colonized by the Europeans in the course of, throughout the grab of Africa and even slightly before that. When they launched their national currencies in these rupees, they issued rupees in these countries. So we have an Italian rupee, we have a German rupee, and sometimes the practice of counter striking for local use was also carried out by other colonial authorities. So we have Indian rupees being countermarked PM with a crown in Portuguese Mozambique. And there is a bit of a kerfuffle over this in the archives in India because they think this is demeaning and sort of insulting the Queen's image, etc. And that sort of goes on, and there's a bit of a commotion between Portugal and Britain at this time. And this is curious because Portuguese and British have remained allies for over 1,000 years. So it was the longest surviving political alliance, and this was sort of thought to be slightly inappropriate, as it were. We have this west of the subcontinent and east of the subcontinent stories, and this is just an example of a banknote that was issued in Germany, East Africa. Again, just a example because the banknotes are quite beautiful. It was just to show that. In Somalia, something interesting happens because we have also the advent of the paper money actually sort of comes even before the metal currency is launched. And this Portuguese, this thing is issued by a company, a private company originally, and this was by a chap called Vicente Filonardi, and he issued his first rupee notes in Somalia. And this is again one of these kind of enterprising characters in this particular place. He was actually a consul general in Zanzibar, and that's where he got this kind of involved into various colonial trading practices. And then he started his own company, and then he was sort of in Mogadishu, and there he issued his first rupee notes, and subsequently then they were taken over by a Italian bank, the colonial bank Banca d'Italia, and this was again issued in this, and this was actually going even before the silver rupees that I showed in. So in case of particularly about Italian rupees, the flow seems to be slightly different. The paper money comes first, and then the coins appear. So it's in that way. Similarly, in the Arabian coast, you have these counter stamping practice going on, and you have Indian rupees being counterstruck with the word Najd, which is the South Arabian kingdom, and also in Yemen, in Hadramaut and southern part of Arabian Peninsula. And that practice then is then taken over by the Brits as well. So we have rupees issued in Mombasa by the British East Africa Company, and also the islands of Mauritius and Seychelles, which then in the course of middle of 20th century, then they start getting monetized. They also start issuing their rupees, as it were. So you have, and some of these countries even now carry on with the denomination. And so this is the whole story about the trade and how it sort of happens over the seas, as it was. It's got maritime, but there was also the spread was also overland. It was not. It was tracking routes of commerce and conquests overland as well. And the main sort of we're talking about looking from the Indian subcontinent northwards and northeastwards and northwestwards really. And some of the trade was again these routes were established for almost a century. So horses trading from Afghanistan and Arabia into India, or indeed the trade of copper and salt with landlocked places like Tibet and Xinjiang were there, and also to Arakan and Myanmar along the Bengal coast. That these were kind of overland trade routes which had a much longer genealogy than these colonial imprints of post 15th century. Conquest is very interesting because one is essential, one salient example of this is the invasion of Nadir Shah, which happened in 1738-39, and um, he carried away a lot of loot to India, to Iran from India, and there were so many rupees with him that he actually reformed the Iranian currency system to fit on the rupee denomination, and therefore the rupee became the main denomination of the Afsharid Empire, and because the Afsharid Empire stretched all the way to Georgia, we have the westernmost instances of rupees being struck are actually in Tbilisi and Dagestan and Derbend, which are in the sort of the Caucasian regions. And something similar happens on the eastern side as well. So that the Sichuan Tibet trade was essentially in things like tea, because the British rupees were common and popular in Tibet. For the trade purposes, Sichuan actually issued rupees that looked like Indian rupees, and we'll see examples of that. And of course, the legacy of all this melee in terms of exchanges and trade and conquest, etc., is that a lot of national currencies in this region are still the rupee. So Indonesia, Nepal, Ceylon or Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Myanmar. Myanmar doesn't call it rupees; it calls it chats, but it's still the origins are very much rupees. Mauritius and Seychelles. So, for example, even Bangladesh calls it taka, but taka is just a synonym for the rupee. And you have these other examples. So, for example, in Afghanistan, it's called Afghani, Bangladesh Taka, Myanmar Chat, and Tibet has Srang. So these are different names, but the coins are very much still rupees. And here are some examples of the westernmost instances of rupees, which is in Tiflis of Nadir Shah, struck absolutely immediately. 1152 is the date on this, and that was the date in which he left Delhi and went back to Iran. Derbend, which is in Dagestan kind of region, just about Azerbaijan and Dagestan itself. So these are westernmost instances of rupees being struck. Um, some examples of the rupees that were historically being circulated in other parts. So, for example, the Afghan rupee, which is of the Durrani Empire, which is minted at bulk, which is again almost on the border of Uzbekistan. And you have an example of a Burmese chat rupee from the sort of 18th and 19th century from the Bodapaya kingdom from South Burma, Central Burma. And these are the examples of the uh, Sichuan trade rupees, where Queen Victoria is then converted into look like a Chinese Mandarin with the same design, copied from the Indian rupees. And here again, a slightly rarer example is also from Yunnan. So you have Sichuan, you have Yunnan. So it's like going way beyond into the east, sort of northeastern parts where the rupees will be struck. And as you have 20th century industrial processes coming in, such as mechanization, these rupees are then sort of issued using machines as well. So you have the earliest examples of rupees being struck in for use in Afghanistan, in the Mint at Birmingham, in the Soho Mint, and then sorry, Heaton, and you have a mint established in Mandalay when King Mindon instituted this kind of machine stock rupee coinage, this beautiful design of the peacock, and also then subsequently later on in late 19th century also slightly primitive mints, but also machine struck with using screw presses, etc., being struck in Nepal. Just an example of the paper currency that still circulates as rupees. You have Indonesia with this the famous note showing the figure of Ganesha as the patron deity of education, because the person who you see on this is an educationist, so therefore Ganesh sort of appears next to him. Quite interesting, particularly in a Muslim country. You have Nepalese rupees, you have examples of Mauritius rupees, and here you can see in some instances the languages that they use and the motifs such as Ganesha that they use have these again reflections of their links with the Indian subcontinent in multifarious ways. So, for example, the Mauritius rupees not only has a value in English, but it also has in Tamil as well as Hindi. It says 1000 rupees there. So it's very much, uh, you know, uh, an imprint of these historical processes that we've been talking about. As one of the sort of most interesting aspects of how the rupee was circulating in is this example of these issues, special issues of what are called as external rupees or Gulf rupees, and that happened in 56 and 57. And again, the third time, to cut a long story very short, this was because of peculiar financial circumstances, the rupee was a legal tender in the Gulf states, what is today the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and after the foundation of the Reserve Bank of India in 1935, at that point, they said that they would allow a certain amount of rupees to circulate as against a silver reserve that they had kept with the Reserve Bank of India. And if at all anything more than that circulates, then they were redeemable to the Reserve Bank of India, but only in foreign exchange equivalent. So after the independence, this sort of arrangement continued. And what happened is because the rupee was legal tender there, people started smuggling rupees to buy gold in these countries and then smuggle the gold back into India, leaving the rupees there, which were then redeemed to the Reserve Bank of India in foreign exchange equivalent. So it was a very peculiar set of circumstances where the Reserve Bank of India was actually paying for smuggling of gold through its foreign exchange equivalent. And the foreign exchange reserves of the Reserve Bank of India were not very strong at this moment. So they were really concerned about. And there was one point I mean, I don't know the figures offhand, but there was one point in 1955 when the remittances for these overseas rupees reached a really alarming figure. It was like, 1/10 of the foreign reserve or something like that. And then they decided that, well, we have to stop this. And therefore, they decided to launch these special notes to be circulated in Gulf. And it was a matter of, well, wonder really that in 56, the actual changeover of rupees that were circulating in the Gulf with these new notes through various banks and various offices went really smoothly. It is quite a fascinating story that it really happened quite all right in that way. And then these rupees started circulating. But then in the 60s, when Indian economy went through a lot of bumps, mainly due to two wars and a series of famines, etc., the Indian rupee was kind of getting a bumpy ride in terms of its exchange value. At the same time, these Gulf states were also discovering oil as an asset for basing their currencies on. So they moved very rapidly in a matter of over that decade towards launching their own currencies and stopping the use of Indian rupees as the external sort of legal tender. The last country to stop the use of Indian rupee as legal tender was Oman, and that was in 1972. But Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Dubai, or the UAE, etc., they stopped it in the 60s, and each of them have an interesting story of how that changeover happened, which again sort of involves the rupee to a certain extent. But that would be much longer story to tell. But this is a very interesting example, more or less a unique example of the central issuing bank of one country issuing its currency, which is floated in visually different notes into some other part, which is not territorially linked with it. So it's an interesting monetary phenomenon, as it were. So to conclude, I would say the success of the international currency, rupee as an international currency, could be encapsulated in this particular little infographic, as it were. And it's a combination of circumstances, mobility, which is mobility of people or mobility of goods, essentially, underpinning the trade, and the agencies of issuing authorities, the agencies of companies, the agencies of political sort of ideology, and that kind of encapsulates how the rupee became a successful international currency, stretching from the Caucasus down to the island of Java, east to west, and north, maybe from Xinjiang and Balkh, all the way to Portuguese Mozambique, and also to a certain extent in South Africa. It's a fascinating story. So On the 75th, in the 75th anniversary of the Indian rupee year, I would like to dedicate this to the history of the rupee, this important chapter. Thank you.